My name is Eames, and I'm a SAR paramedic, search and rescue out here in the Rockies. I've seen a lot: mangled climbers, hikers frozen solid, the aftermath of animal attacks. You get used to it. Well, not used to it, but you learn to compartmentalize. To put it in a box in your head, shut the lid, and not look inside until the next call. But what we ran into last month, I don't have a box for this. There's no lid. It just sits in the back of my skull, staring out of the darkness, and it won't leave. And I'm writing this here because I can't keep it inside anymore. I need someone else to know. I need it to not just be my burden. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe what I saw has some logical explanation that I'm just not seeing. Or maybe it doesn't. Either way, I have to tell this story. It all started with a call. A private plane, a small Cessna, had gone missing. It was flying from Denver to a private airstrip in Montana. 4 people on board: the pilot, Grant Weaver, and 3 passengers, businessmen heading to some kind of deal. Richard Lang, Nathaniel Price, and Ethan Rowe. Rich guys, from the sound of it. Their flight path took them over one of the wildest, most rugged sections of the range. They lost contact somewhere over the national park. The search went on for almost a week with no luck. The terrain out there is a special kind of hell. Dense forest, canyons, sheer rock faces. Spotting anything from the air is next to impossible. On top of that, an early snowstorm rolled in, making everything even harder. Eventually, the active search was called off. The chances of finding anyone alive after that long in those conditions were basically zero. The families were notified that the search would resume in the spring when the snow melted. It's standard procedure. Brutal, but realistic. A month went by. One of the local hunters who works that area stumbled across some strange debris. Large, shredded pieces of metal scattered down a mountainside. He called it in, and just like that, our team was back in business. This time we had solid coordinates. There were 6 of us. Me, our unit commander Mike, 2 veteran climber rescuers, Jenna and Carlos, and a couple of rookies we were training up. The chopper dropped us on the nearest viable landing zone, and we hiked in from there. The mood was heavy. We all knew we were on a recovery mission, not a rescue. We found the crash site after a couple of hours. The scene was grim, but it was familiar territory for us. The Cessna had slammed into the side of the mountain, carving a scar through the trees. The fuselage was torn into several pieces. The cockpit was crushed like a tin can. Wreckage was scattered in a 100-yard radius. The silence was so profound it felt like a pressure in my ears, broken only by the wind sighing through the pines. We split up and started a grid search, following protocol. Our job was to find the bodies, personal effects, the black box, anything that could help the investigation. The month-old snow had started to melt, but the ground was still damp and cold. The smell of pine was mixed with the faint, cloying sweetness of decay and jet fuel. The first red flag was the state of the bodies, or rather, the lack of them in the way we usually find them. We found fragments, bloody pieces of clothing frozen into the mud, bones, but no intact bodies. That was weird. Usually, even if animals get to a site, you find remains still strapped into their seats. Here, the seats were torn from their moorings, and the passengers were just pieces. Mike figured it was grizzlies. Maybe the unseasonably warm spell had woken one up. It found an easy meal and dragged everything off. It sounded logical enough. We kept searching, marking each finding with a small flag. I was checking the tail section of the plane, which had broken off and gotten wedged between two massive boulders. Inside, everything was a wreck. Luggage, papers, upholstery, all of it a soggy, shredded mess. And it was there, under a scrap of a leather seat, that I found it. A small GoPro-style camera in a tough, waterproof case. It was off, but surprisingly intact. I pressed the power button. The little screen lit up. It still worked. Protocol says I should have immediately handed it over to Mike as evidence. But something stopped me. A morbid curiosity, a professional need to know. Call it what you want. I wanted to understand what happened here. Not from an aviation expert's point of view, but from the perspective of the people who were here in their final moments. I slipped the camera into my jacket pocket and kept working. That evening, when we'd set up a temporary camp and Mike was radioing our findings back to base, I walked away from the fire, sat on a fallen log, and turned on the camera. There were a few dozen files on the memory card. I opened the first one. Log 1. Day 1. The screen shook violently, then stabilized. The camera was obviously head-mounted. I could hear the roar of the engine, then a sudden, deafening shriek of tearing metal. Darkness. The frame jolted, and I was looking at the plane's cabin, tilted at an insane angle. Screaming. Someone praying. The camera panned to a window. Sky and earth spinning in a chaotic blur. Then, impact. The screen went black. A few seconds of silence. Then, heavy breathing, moans. The camera switched on again. The view was of the mangled cabin. Snow and tree branches poked through a rupture in the fuselage. The man wearing the camera had clearly survived. He unbuckled his belt and struggled to his feet. Rich? Nate? Grant? The voice was hoarse, terrified. It must have been Ethan Rowe. Based on the passenger list, he was the only one likely to have a camera like this. He was known for his love of extreme sports. He moved slowly through the cabin, stepping over debris. The camera caught a glimpse of the pilot's body hanging limply in his harness in the smashed cockpit. Oh God, Grant. Rowe whispered. Then he found the other two. Richard Lang was clearly injured. He was slumped against a wall, clutching a leg that had a piece of metal sticking out of it. Nathaniel Price was conscious but in shock, just staring at nothing. The first log ended as Rowe tried to give Lang first aid, using strips of his shirt for a bandage. I skipped through the next few files. They were short. Rowe was keeping a sort of video diary. He explained that the pilot died on impact, that Lang had a bad fracture and possible internal injuries, that Price wasn't saying a word. They'd found a small supply of food, some protein bars and bottles of water. They tried the radio, but it was smashed. They knew they'd be searched for, so they decided to wait. Log 5. Day 3. Snow hasn't stopped. It's so cold. We're burning pieces of the seats to stay warm, but it won't last. Food's almost gone. Rich is getting weaker. He's running a fever. I think he's got an infection. Nate. Something's wrong with him. He barely sleeps. Just sits and stares into the woods. Sometimes I think he's sniffing the air. He says he smells meat. I told him it's probably just the fuel and burnt plastic, but he just shakes his head. I'm starting to get creeped out by the way he looks at us. On the video, Price did look strange. He was sitting at the edge of the broken fuselage they were using for shelter, his eyes glinting with a feverish light from the fire. He was a lean, wiry man with sharp features, and he kept twitching his nose like a hound catching a scent. Log 9, Day 6. The camera clicks on in the middle of the night. All I can hear is the crackle of the fire and Rowe's ragged breathing. He's whispering. He's gone. Price is gone. I woke up because I was freezing. The fire was almost out. He's not here. I called for him. No answer. Where the hell would he go in a blizzard like this? Ro grabs a flashlight and steps outside. The snow is coming down in thick flakes. The beam of the light catches a set of tracks. Human. But something's wrong with them. They're too deep, and the gait is strange. After a few yards, the tracks change. Next to the boot prints, there are hand prints, like he got down on all fours. What the? Ro whispers. He follows the tracks, and the further he goes, the stranger they get. The boot prints vanish. Now there are only prints from hands and... knees? No, not knees. Bare feet. Deep, clear prints of bare hands and feet in the snow. Ro scrambles backward in terror, running back to the plane. The recording cuts out. A chill ran down my spine. What the hell? A man goes for a walk, barefoot and on all fours in the snow. I told myself it had to be a delusion, brought on by starvation and hypothermia. A hallucination. A log 12. Day 7. Morning. Ro is talking to the camera. His face is gaunt with dark circles under his eyes. Price came back just before dawn. He was covered in snow and blood. I asked him where he'd been. He just looked at me and smiled. And then he showed me this. The camera pans down. Lying on a piece of tarp is a piece of meat. Raw, red, with tufts of dark fur still clinging to it. He said he found a deer. Said he brought it down with his bare hands. I don't believe him. He doesn't have a knife, no weapon. How could he do that? And his eyes, they're different. Hard, hungry. He's eating it. Raw. I can't watch. In the background, Price is visible. He's squatting, his back to the camera, tearing at the meat with his teeth. The sound he's making is wet and disgusting, a series of rips and chomps. Log 15. Day 9. Richard Lang died. Ro recorded a short, choked message. He was crying. He said they buried him as best they could, under a pile of rocks not far from the plane. Price didn't help. He just watched, with that same strange smile. When we were done, he walked over to the grave. He started sniffing at the dirt, like an animal. I yelled at him to get away. He looked at me, and I swear to God, I saw his pupils contract to pinpricks. He licked his lips. Oh God, he licked his lips. I had to chase him off with a stick. He spent the whole night circling the camp. I didn't sleep a second. I had to pause the video. My stomach turned. I looked over at our camp. Mike and the others were by the fire, talking quietly, sipping hot coffee from thermoses, a normal night on the job. And here I was, just feet away, watching a private horror movie that had played out on this exact spot a month ago. I forced myself to continue. Log 18. Day 12. Ro looks terrible. He's barely speaking above a whisper. He dug up the grave. He did it. In the night while I was asleep. I woke up to the sound of cracking. He was over there with what was left of Rich, and he was eating. I can't. I just can't. I ran. I'm hiding in the cockpit. I barricaded the door. He's outside. He knows I'm in here. He's scratching at the door. He's not human anymore. His voice has changed. He doesn't speak. He growls, makes these guttural sounds. The camera is shaking in Ro's hands. From outside, I could actually hear scraping sounds and a low, guttural growl that made the hair on my neck stand up. It wasn't the sound a person makes. Log 21. Day 15. A few days have passed. Ro is still locked in the cockpit. He says Price leaves during the day, then comes back at night. Sometimes he brings back kills, rabbits, squirrels. He eats them raw, right outside the cockpit door. I think I figured it out. The pilot's body, Grant, it's gone. I didn't notice at first, but he's not in his seat anymore. Price? He must have eaten him first. While Rich and I were too weak to notice. He's been feeding this whole time, getting stronger, while we were getting weaker. His sense of smell, it's unbelievable. He can smell anything. His sight. He can see in the dark like a cat. I saw his eyes through a crack in the door. They glow in the dark. Yellow. It's not Price anymore. It's something else. Something that got inside him. Log 24. Day 20. Roe is out of the cockpit. He says Price has gone hunting, and this is his chance. He's going to run for it. He doesn't know where. Just away. I went through his things, found his wallet. There's a picture. His wife, 2 kids. He was a normal guy. What happened to him? There's something out here. In these woods. Something old and hungry. It found the weakness in him. The hunger. And it got in. Turned him into this. I've read about it. In old legends. The native tribes called it. He never finishes the sentence. There's a snap of a twig. Roe freezes. The camera whips around. No, he breathes. From between the trees, Price emerges. But it's not really Price anymore. He's walking on 2 legs, but hunched over, unnaturally low to the ground. His clothes are in tatters. His skin is pale, almost gray, stretched tight over his bones. His fingernails are long, caked with dirt, more like claws. But the worst part was his face. His eyes glowed with a yellow light. His mouth was stretched into a predatory grin, revealing teeth that looked sharpened and yellowed. He's looking right at the camera, right at Roe, and right at me. Ethan. The voice sounds like grinding rocks. So hungry. Roe screams and runs. The camera shakes. The image a blur. All I can hear is his ragged, panicked screaming and the thud of his feet. Behind him there's a pursuing snarl and a rapid, heavy thudding, the sound of 4 limbs hitting the frozen ground. The thing that was Price was chasing him on all 4s. The recording cuts out. That was the last file I watched that night. I couldn't take any more. I just sat there, frozen, staring into the dark woods beyond the small circle of our campfire. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made me jump. The wind in the pines now sounded like a malevolent whisper. The next day we continued our work. We found more fragments, and I saw them differently now. I didn't see the work of a grizzly anymore. I saw what could have been human bite marks. Bones that were snapped as if they'd been gnawed on. I said nothing to the team. What was I supposed to tell them? That one of the passengers had turned into a cannibalistic monster from Native American folklore. They'd have me on a psych hold before I could finish the sentence. By the end of the 2nd day, we'd collected everything we could find. The remains were sealed in evidence bags. The artifacts in containers. I was supposed to turn in the camera. But I couldn't. I had to know how it ended. When we got back to base, I called in sick and took a couple of days off. I went home, locked myself in my room, and turned the camera back on. I realized I'd missed the last couple of files. They were corrupted, probably when the camera was dropped. I ran a recovery program on my laptop. After a few hours, it managed to salvage 1 more fragment. The last one. Log 25. Day 20. Continued. The image flickers to life. The camera is lying on the ground, lens pointed up, filming the canopy of the trees and the gray sky. Roe must have dropped it when he ran. You can hear his desperate, ragged breathing somewhere nearby, just out of frame. Then, a snarl. Get away from me, you thing!" Roe shrieks, and then IT enters the frame. The creature that was Price. It looms over Roe, who must be on the ground. It moves slowly, with a horrifying, predatory grace. Long, thin limbs, gray skin, glowing eyes. It bares its teeth and lets out a low, gurgling sound. Roe screams in terror. This looks like the end. But then, something impossible happens. From deeper in the woods, a piercing, soul-freezing shriek echoes through the trees. It's unlike any animal or human cry I have ever heard. It is pure hunger and primal rage. The price thing freezes. It turns its head toward the sound. Its predatory grin is replaced by something that looks like fear? It drops lower to the ground, growling, but there's no confidence in it now. And then from between the trees, the other one steps into the camera's view. It was huge. 9, maybe 10 feet tall at least. Impossibly thin. Like a skeleton wrapped in gray, translucent skin that showed the black bones beneath. Its head was a deer skull, crowned with massive, branching antlers that were blackened and splintered. In its empty sockets, eyes burned with a dead, pale fire. It moved silently, its clawed, deformed feet making no sound on the frozen ground. A visible vapor came off its skin, as if it were forged from deep winter ice. Wendigo. I'd read about them. Heard stories from some of the old-timers on the local reservations. The spirit of insatiable hunger. The creature a man becomes if he resorts to cannibalism in the wilderness. But I never believed it. I thought it was just a scary story, a cautionary tale. And there it was, right in front of me, on the screen of a tiny camera. The price thing let out a high-pitched scream, a mix of fury and terror. It launched itself at the Wendigo. It wasn't a fight, it was a collision of nightmares. They tumbled across the ground, snarling, biting, tearing at each other with their claws. The camera recorded the chaos. A blur of gray bodies, the sound of ripping flesh, the crunch of bone. I don't know how long it lasted. A minute. An eternity. Suddenly the Wendigo, being so much larger and stronger, grabbed the price thing with one enormous clawed hand, lifted it into the air and slammed it against the trunk of a tree with monstrous force. There was a sickening wet crack. The price thing's body went limp. The Wendigo dropped it to the ground. It stood over the body for a moment, then tilted back its skull-like head and let out a long, victorious howl. Then it grabbed the lifeless body, slung it over its shoulder as if it weighed nothing, and without a backward glance, stalked back into the forest. The camera kept recording. The only sound was a quiet, terrified whimpering. Roe. He was still alive. He crawled into the frame, covered in mud and someone else's blood. He looked directly into the lens. His eyes were wide, empty, and utterly insane. He didn't say a word, just lay there staring. Then the screen went black. The battery had finally died. I sat in front of my laptop, shaking. I couldn't breathe. It was too much, too real. I replayed the footage. Again and again. I tried to find any sign that it was fake. CGI. Anything. But it looked horrifyingly real. The next day I had to go back to work. I had to turn in the camera, but I couldn't let that footage go. I knew if it fell into the wrong hands, it would be classified, buried, and I'd probably be forced to keep quiet or declared crazy. So I did something stupid. I copied the files to a secure hard drive. I formatted the original memory card. Then I turned in the camera to Mike, telling him I'd found it at the last minute and the memory card was blank, probably fried from the impact. He didn't question it, just tossed it in the evidence box. A few weeks passed. The crash investigation moved forward. The official cause was pilot error and weather conditions. The human remains. There were too few. The coroner chalked it up to animal scavenging. No one asked any hard questions. The case was closed. But I couldn't find any peace. I kept watching those files. I started digging, looking for information on the Wendigo, for reports of unexplained disappearances in that area. I found things. Old newspaper clippings, sheriff's reports going back 100 years, stories of lost hunters, missing hikers, all officially blamed on the wilderness. But now I could see a sinister pattern. Then, the kicker. A couple of days ago, they came to my house. 2 men, sharp black suits. Didn't introduce themselves. Just flashed some ID I didn't get a good look at. They said they were with the NTSB, but they didn't look like any investigators I'd ever seen. Their eyes were like chips of steel. They asked me about the crash. Very specific questions. About the condition of the remains. About any anomalies I might have noticed. I played dumb. I lied and said it was a standard recovery. They looked at me like they knew I was lying. Then one of them said, "Mr. Eames, a video camera was recovered at the crash site. It was found in your search sector. You turned it over to your supervisor with a blank memory card. We just want to confirm, are you certain there was nothing on it? No corrupted files, nothing unusual at all?" My heart fell into my stomach. How did they know? I lied again. Said I didn't see a thing. They were silent for a moment, and then the older one said, "Sometimes the best thing a person can do for their own peace of mind is to forget what they saw. Some things in this world aren't meant to be understood. They just are. And it's our job to make sure most people never have to know about them." And then they left. They didn't threaten me. They didn't demand anything. But I got the message. They know, or they suspect, and they're watching me. As for Ethan Rowe, he was never found. Officially, he's listed as a missing person. But I think I know what happened to him. A couple of weeks ago, a highway patrolman found a man wandering down the shoulder of a highway 100 miles from the crash site. He was emaciated, dressed in rags, and couldn't speak a coherent word. Just mumbled and stared at everyone with wild, terrified eyes. They took him to a high-security psychiatric hospital. The patient's name is sealed. I'm sure it was him. He saw what I saw on that footage, and it broke him. So that's the story. All of it. I don't know what to do now. I have a copy of that footage. I'm afraid to keep it, but I'm terrified to destroy it. Those men in suits might come back, and I can't sleep. Every night when I close my eyes, I see it. The glowing yellow eyes of Nathaniel Price, and the tall, skeletal figure with the deer skull for a head, walking back into the dark woods. I'm a rescuer. My job is to save people. But how are you supposed to save someone from something that lives in the heart of hunger and desperation itself? And how do you save yourself when you know that it's out there, in the dark, and it's real? I don't know. But now you know too. And maybe that changes something. Though if I'm being honest, I really doubt it. Story 2. I shouldn't be writing this. If my employers find out I'm breaking 5 different NDAs and potentially violating federal law, I won't just be fired. I'll likely be retired to some windowless institution where I'll spend the rest of my life counting ceiling tiles. But I can't keep it inside anymore. I need someone to read this. I need someone other than me to know what happened in the backwoods of Montana. Maybe I'm just insane. God, I pray I'm insane. My name is Dr. Amelia Oakes. Until recently, I was a field virologist epidemiologist for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In layman's terms, I was the person they sent to the world's worst hotspots whenever something new and nasty popped up. I've worked in Ebola hot zones in the Congo, tracked avian flu outbreaks across Asia, and taken samples from bat-infested caves. I thought I'd seen everything. I thought nothing could scare me because everything had a scientific explanation. A virus is just a protein shell with a strand of genetic code inside. It isn't evil. It just is. I was wrong. It all started 3 months ago. I was called into my supervisor's office, Dr. Stephen Wright. He was a dry, by-the-book kind of man who loved protocols and flowcharts more than people. When I walked in, he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at a massive screen on the wall displaying a satellite map of northern Montana. A huge section of it was colored deep red. "Quarantine Zone CWD-7, he said, tapping the screen. CWD is chronic wasting disease, a prion disease that affects deer, elk, and moose. The media calls it zombie deer disease. It turns an animal's brain into a sponge, causing it to act erratically, lose its fear of humans, and slowly starve to death. The CWD-7 strain was particularly aggressive. It had learned to jump the species barrier, infecting predators, wolves, bears, mountain lions. That's why, years ago, a massive section of National Park and the surrounding forest was declared a strict quarantine zone. No one in, no one out. What's the problem, Stephen? Another deer running for mayor? I tried to joke. He didn't smile. 3 days ago, our thermal imaging satellites picked up an anomaly in the heart of the zone, right here. He pointed to a tiny dot glowing bright orange against the cool blue of the forest. The temperature is a steady 95 to 98 degrees Fahrenheit, too large and stable for a forest fire, and too warm for a geothermal spring in that region. Animal life? I suggested. A herd of elk huddled together? Too dense, Wright said, shaking his head. And it's not moving. At all. We checked the old maps. There's a settlement in that grid square, or there was, a community called the Sons of the Soil. I frowned. I'd heard of them. Radical survivalists, religious zealots who'd gone off-grid back in the 90s to live in harmony with nature and wait for the end of the world. When the quarantine was established, officials tried to evacuate them, but they refused. They barricaded themselves in and declared that the hand of man will not touch our land. The government decided to avoid a bloodbath and just left them there, writing them off. Everyone assumed they'd starved to death or succumbed to the disease years ago. They're alive, I said, more a statement than a question. It appears so, and we need to know why. Officially, Oaks, this is a humanitarian mission. You're going in to assess their health, offer aid and medicine. Your cover is Doctors Without Borders. Not a word about the CDC, not a word about the satellites. And unofficially, Wright finally looked at me. His eyes were more serious than I'd ever seen them. Unofficially, you find out what the hell is going on. How have they survived in a zone where even the bears are dying, bleeding from their eyes? How are they dealing with CWD? Get samples, blood, saliva, whatever you can. But be careful. These people have been cut off from the world for almost 30 years. We have no idea what they've become. 2 days later, I was in Montana. A chopper dropped me at the edge of the quarantine zone, where an all-terrain vehicle and a guide named Hank were waiting. Hank was a former park ranger, a quiet man with a wind-beaten face and eyes that looked like they'd seen it all. He was the only one who knew the old trails that led to the settlement. "Bad place," he said as we loaded my gear. "The animals there, they're strange now. Not scared of anything. They move wrong like broken puppets." The drive took nearly 8 hours. We followed overgrown trails through a thick, dark forest. The trees stood so close together that it was twilight even at noon. The air was still and heavy, smelling of damp earth and something else. Something sickly sweet, like rotting meat. We saw deer several times, standing by the side of the trail. They didn't run. They just stood and watched us with their clouded, indifferent eyes. One of them had its lower jaw broken and hanging loose, but it didn't seem to notice. By evening, we arrived. The Sons of the Soil lived in a small valley surrounded by rocky cliffs. The village was a dozen crudely built log cabins arranged around a central square with a large fire pit. Smoke curled from a few chimneys. It all looked surprisingly peaceful, almost idyllic, if you ignored the complete dead silence. There was no laughter of children, no barking dogs, no sounds of work. A tall, thin man in homespun clothes met us. He had a long gray beard and deep-set eyes. He introduced himself as Abraham, the community's elder. "We knew you would come," he said in a quiet, even voice. The Forest Father whispered to us. I ignored the mystical bullshit. "I'm a doctor with a humanitarian aid group. We learned you were here and came to offer medical assistance." Abraham nodded slowly. "We have need of it. Many are sick. Come." He led me to the largest cabin, which served as both a church and an infirmary. It was clean inside, but it smelled of ozone and sickness. Along the walls, people lay on wooden cots. And that's when I felt the first real, sticky tendril of fear. The villagers were divided into two groups, and the difference was stark. On the left side of the room were those I mentally labeled the hot ones. There were about 10 of them. They were all pale, but their skin glistened with sweat. They were breathing heavily, as if they'd just run a marathon. Next to each cot was a bucket of ice-cold stream water, which they drank in huge gulps or used to sponge themselves down. One man was scratching himself incessantly, clawing his arms raw. "The itch. It's maddening, doctor," he whispered to me, "like 1,000 ants crawling under my skin." I took his temperature. 105 degrees. A lethal fever. On the right side lay the cold ones. There were slightly more of them. They were bundled in layers of blankets and furs, despite a pot-bellied stove in the center of the room glowing red-hot. Their skin was dry and papery with a strange grayish-blue tint, like that of a drowning victim. Their movements were slow, sluggish. As I approached one woman to take her temperature, she looked up at me, and I saw that the whites of her eyes weren't white, but a dull, ashen gray. Her temperature was 94 degrees. Hypothermia. "What is this?" I asked Abraham, trying to keep my voice professional. "A trial from God," he answered, staring at something beyond the wall. "Fire and ice. He burns some from within and freezes others. It began years ago, after we ate a sick deer. We thought it was a punishment, but then we understood. It is a blessing." I didn't argue. I set up my field lab, a portable microscope, a centrifuge, test kits. I explained that I needed blood samples to identify the illness. No one objected. They complied with the apathy of the condemned. Hank stayed outside with the ATV. He said he wouldn't set foot in the village. "I don't know, Doc. They smell like sickness. Not the flu, something deeper, something in their bones. I can smell it from a mile away. I'm not going in there." I started drawing blood. The blood of the hot ones was bright scarlet, almost orange, and incredibly thick. It clotted almost instantly. The blood of the cold ones was dark, almost black, and thin as water. I put the first sample under the microscope. One of the hot ones. What I saw made me forget how to breathe. I expected to see deformed red blood cells, maybe some viral particles. But this was something else entirely. The CWD7 prions weren't just destroying the cells. They were rebuilding them. Imagine a construction crew on a skyscraper suddenly goes insane and starts building something monstrous and alien using the same materials. The prions were acting like nanobots. They were disassembling cellular structures and reassembling them with terrifying speed and efficiency. The mitochondria, our cellular power plants, were swollen to 10 times their normal size, pulsing like miniature suns, generating enormous amounts of heat. That explained the fever and the sweat. It was a metabolism overclocked to a suicidal level. Then I looked at the blood from a cold one. The picture was the opposite, but no less horrifying. Here, the prions were attacking the mitochondria, extinguishing them like candles. The cells were shifting into an extreme energy conservation mode. Melanin, the pigment in our skin, was being broken down. The cells were becoming translucent. That explained the gray skin and low temperature. The body was dying, but very, very slowly. 2 strains. 2 opposing survival strategies from the same pathogen. I realized I was sitting on a biological bomb. This wasn't just a disease. This was evolution in real time. Monstrous, perverse, but evolution nonetheless. I scrambled for my radio. I had to call for an evac, a quarantine, burn this place to the ground.
Base, this is Oaks. Come in. Requesting immediate extraction. Protocol Phase 0. I repeat, Phase 0.
Phase 0 was the code for a pandemic-level threat we'd never encountered before. A signal that should have sent every agency scrambling. The only reply was the hiss of static. I tried again and again. Nothing. Abraham, standing in the doorway, watched me with a sad smile. The Forest Father doesn't like loud noises. It won't let your voice leave this place. I looked from him to the radio, and a chill crawled down my spine. The antenna was fine. The battery was fully charged. There was no signal. The valley was surrounded by cliffs rich with iron ore. They formed a natural barrier, a Faraday cage. We were trapped. The sun began to set. Red light filtered through the dense canopy, painting everything in bloody hues. And then I noticed something else strange. All the villagers, both hot and cold, had turned their heads to the windows, watching the setting sun. There was no fear in their eyes. There was anticipation. "You should lock yourself in, Doctor," Abraham said, his voice losing its softness, becoming as dry as rustling leaves. "The night belongs to them. The sunlight, the UV radiation. It suppresses the prion's activity, slows it down. But when the sun goes down, their true life begins." He stepped out and closed the heavy wooden door behind him. I heard the sound of a thick bar sliding into place on the outside. I was alone in the infirmary, lit only by a kerosene lamp and the last embers of sunset. A tense, ringing silence fell over the village, the kind that comes before a lightning strike. I stood at my microscope, trying to process Abraham's words. A biological switch triggered by the absence of UV light? It sounded insane. But everything I'd seen today was insane. And as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the cliffs, the first sound came from the village. It wasn't a scream. It was a wet, crunching sound, the sound of bones breaking. I ran to a small, grimy window and peered outside. What I saw burned itself onto my retinas forever. The man I'd examined, the one who'd complained of the itch, was standing in the middle of the square. He wasn't scratching anymore. He was tearing at his own skin. His body convulsed. Steam billowed from his skin like he was an overheating engine. His eyes. God, his eyes. The capillaries had burst, turning them into 2 solid red orbs glowing in the twilight. His muscles were swelling at an unnatural rate, ripping his skin from the inside. Through the bloody tears on his back, chest, and arms, thick, black, wiry fur erupted. This wasn't normal hair growth. This was hypertrichosis on steroids, instantaneous and monstrous. His jaw dislocated with a crack and jutted forward, revealing elongated, needle-like teeth. He let out a roar. Not human, but a sound of pain, fury, and ravenous hunger. He was one of the hot ones. The strain I'd mentally dubbed Lycaio, from the Greek for wolf. Then I saw what was happening to the cold ones. The woman with the ashen skin crawled out of her cabin, but she wasn't walking. She was moving on all fours, her limbs bending at impossible angles. Her body had become impossibly thin and elongated, as if her bones had softened and stretched. She was molting, sloughing off her skin like a snake, leaving damp gray tatters on the ground behind her. Underneath was a new skin, slick, translucent, and pale gray, coated in mucus. She raised her head, and I saw her face had changed too. Her nose and ears had vanished, retracted into her skull. Her mouth had become a round, lamprey-like sucker. And then she made a sound. It was my mother's voice. "Amy, sweetie, open the door. I'm so cold, let me in." I stumbled back from the window, clamping my hands over my ears. My mother died of cancer 10 years ago, but the voice was a perfect replica. Every inflection, every nuance. I realized their vocal cords had mutated, becoming perfect mimicry instruments. They could replicate any sound they had ever heard. The Wendigo strain, the Wendigo from the old legends, creatures of cold and hunger. The slaughter began. Cabin doors burst open and the rest of them poured into the square. A dozen roaring, steaming Lycaio looking like nightmarish werewolves, and 15 or so slick, silent Wendigo skittering like spiders up walls and across roofs. This wasn't a chaotic brawl. It was a hunt. The Lycaio, blinded by adrenal fury, charged at anything that moved. They were brute force incarnate. But the Wendigo were smarter. They moved in the shadows, scrambled onto rooftops, blended into the darkness, and they were hunting the Lycaio. I watched a Wendigo drop from a roof onto the back of a massive Lycaio. It clung to the furred back with its twig-like limbs and pressed its body flat. The Lycaio roared, trying to shake it off, but it couldn't. Then I realized what the Wendigo was doing. It wasn't biting or scratching. It was prying the overheated body of the Lycaio open, trying to get inside. They needed external warmth. Their own bodies couldn't produce it, so they sought it in others. The hot blood, the superheated muscles of the Lycaio were a perfect furnace. This was a biological war between two strains, two opposite extremes of the same virus. A symbiotic hunt between predator and prey who had been neighbors just yesterday. Abraham, the elder, was now a mountain of muscle and claws. I only recognized him by the remnants of his beard on his chin. He caught one of the Wendigo. From the slender frame, I realized it was his own son, whom I'd seen that afternoon. He didn't hesitate. He simply tore the creature in two. No blood came from the Wendigo's ruptured body. Instead, a thick, clear, gel-like fluid spilled out and froze almost instantly on the cold ground. I was trapped in the infirmary. The walls were thin logs. I could hear every snarl, every shriek, every wet tearing of flesh. And the voices. The voices kept calling to me.
"Dr. Oakes, this is Stephen Wright. We got your signal. Open up. We're here to get you." My boss's voice, down to the last irritated note. "Help! Please, somebody help me!" Hank's voice, my guide. And then, my own voice. "The door is jammed. I can't get out."
They were using everything they'd heard during the day. They were tape recorders, playing back sounds to lure out their prey. They knew I was in here. And then, it hit me. In this ecosystem of horror, I was the one prize both sides wanted. To the Lycaio, I was just fresh, uninfected meat. To the Wendigo, I was a perfect heat source. My normal 98.6 degrees was like a fireplace on a winter night. I was the target. I was the only source of clean resources in this closed system. I started barricading the door. The table, cots, crates of medical supplies. A tremendous crash shook the cabin. The wood splintered. One of the Lycow was trying to break through. I could see its red eyes through a crack between the logs. But then something dropped from the roof. I heard a dull thud, followed by a gurgling shriek from the Lycow. When I looked through the crack again, 3 Wendigo were swarming it like ants on a sugar cube. I was caught between 2 species of monster, and I was out of time. I had to think. Think like a biologist. What was their weakness? I frantically ran through everything I'd seen. The Lycow, their hypermetabolism. They were already on the verge of overheating. An external heat source would be agonizing. They had to fear fire. The Wendigo, their bodies. They molted, revealing dry, parchment-like tissue coated in a flammable mucus. And the tissues themselves were desiccated. They had to be like tinder. They were drawn to warmth, but the fire itself should destroy them. Fire. The answer was fire. I looked at the kerosene lamp on the table, then at the medical cabinet. Rubbing alcohol. Gauze. Hydrogen peroxide. I had everything I needed to make a bonfire. It was a crazy plan. I had to burn my only shelter to escape. I worked fast, my hands shaking. I doused the curtains, the wooden cots, the walls with alcohol. I made a few Molotov cocktails from saline solution bottles, stuffing them with alcohol-soaked gauze. Outside, the sounds of the fight began to die down. That was bad. It meant they were finishing with each other and would soon remember me. I heard a quiet scraping on the wall right next to the window. A Wendigo was closing in. I touched the wick of one of my improvised bombs to the lamp. The fabric ignited. I swung back and hurled the bottle at the barricaded door. Glass shattered. Flame roared outwards. A high-pitched, thin shriek like a rabbit on fire came from outside. It was followed by the furious, pained roar of a Lycow that had obviously been too close. I lit a second bottle and threw it into the far corner of the room. Fire instantly consumed the dry logs. The infirmary was becoming a death trap. I had seconds to get out. I ran to the back wall, where there was a small ventilation window. I smashed the frame with the stock of an emergency shotgun I found in the corner. Smoke was already stinging my eyes. The heat was unbearable. I squeezed through the narrow opening, tearing the skin on my shoulders, and tumbled outside into the night air. And I ran. I ran through the burning village toward the spot where we'd left the ATV. Hell had broken loose around me. The fire from the infirmary had spread to the neighboring cabins. In the flickering light, I saw nightmarish silhouettes. The Wendigo were drawn to the flames like moths, and they went up like matchsticks. They writhed on the ground, turning into blackened, smoking husks, and they shrieked. They shrieked in human voices, the voices of children, women, and men, begging for help. The Lycow, conversely, fled in panic from the heat. The fire was agony to them. They whimpered like beaten dogs and vanished into the darkness of the forest, taking their wounds with them. I didn't look back. I just ran, leaping over bodies, tripping on roots. My lungs burned. Adrenaline fueled me. The ATV. I had to get to the ATV. It was where we'd left it, in a small clearing at the edge of the valley. Hank was gone. On the ground by the driver's side door, I saw his rifle in a large, dark stain. I didn't let myself look closer. I just jumped into the cab, found the keys in the ignition, and turned them. The engine coughed to life. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The ATV lurched forward, its headlights cutting a swath through the wall of trees. I wrenched the wheel and tore down the trail we'd come in on. I drove for several minutes before I dared to look in the rearview mirror. I was terrified of what I might see, but I finally broke. I took a quick glance. Behind me, the Sons of the Soil settlement was a funeral pyre, and on the roof of my ATV, directly above my head, a figure was perched. It was one of the cold ones. It hadn't burned. It must have been far enough from the flames. It was crouched there, clinging to the metal roof, absorbing the heat from the running engine and the exhaust. It wasn't attacking. It was just sitting there, thin, gray, and slick. And it was looking at me in the rearview mirror. That's when I screamed, because it was looking at me with my own eyes. Not eyes like mine. An exact copy. The same shade of green, the same gold flecks around the pupil. I remembered the moment I drew his blood that afternoon. He was one of the cold ones, a young man. Our eyes had met for just a second. That was all it took. He'd copied them. I drove like a madwoman through the forest. Branches whipped against the windshield. I was crying and screaming, but I didn't stop. I drove all night, until at dawn I crashed out of the quarantine zone and onto a service road where a forestry patrol found me. In my official report, I wrote that there was an outbreak of an unknown hemorrhagic fever in the settlement, which led to mass hysteria and a fire. That I was the sole survivor. They believed me, or they pretended to. They put me on long-term medical leave to recover from psychological trauma. I'm in therapy. I'm on a mountain of pills. They say it's PTSD, that my brain invented monsters to cope with the horror I witnessed. But I know it was real. And there's one more detail. A detail I didn't include in my report, that I haven't told anyone until now. As I was driving through that forest with that thing on the roof staring at me with my own eyes, I heard a whisper in my head. It wasn't a sound. It was pure data. Thoughts. Formulas. The complex biochemical equations describing the prion structure. Amino acid sequences. Replication schematics. The very conclusions I had just begun to form in my mind while looking through the microscope, but had not yet had time to articulate or write down. It was whispering my own discoveries back to me. The prions in that forest weren't acting randomly. They were synchronized. A single entity. Like they were being controlled by an unseen conductor. A hive mind spread throughout the forest. The forest father, as Abraham called it. And that mind was learning. It analyzed me through a single drop of my own blood. It understood my biology, my thought processes, and it let me go. Sometimes at night, I wake up in a cold sweat. I think I can hear that whisper in my head. I check the satellite images of the quarantine zone. The thermal anomaly is gone. The village is dead. But I know this isn't the end. That wasn't an outbreak. It was a field test. An experiment. It was phase 0. And I wasn't the sole survivor. I was the courier. I carried it out. Not in my blood. In my mind. It planted a seed. And now it's waiting.